issues for our future, and it's why we need a change of government.
Paul Goldsmith.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was very interested to hear the previous speaker talking about social mobility. I would have thought the best way to achieve social mobility is to grow the economy, and that is how you give people the opportunity to get onto the ladder of work, to make some money and to get ahead. And everything that party stands for seems to be against economic growth, and so, by my reckoning, against economic and social mobility. This government retains the support of so many New Zealanders at a time when many governments around the world are struggling because it has maintained a strong and consistent economic policy. And the pillars of those policy, first of all, of course, are returning to surplus, getting this country's books back in order, Mr. Speaker. And the budget policy statement that we're looking at today forecasts a modest operating surplus in 14-15 of around $66 million, which is a huge achievement, taking it back from $18 billion hole that we had 2 years ago. And that means we will stop borrowing for operational expenditure and we'll be able to start repaying debt before too long, Mr. Speaker. And why is that important? Because countries that meet spending and debt problems head-on with control inspire confidence amongst investors, and that reduces the costs of borrowing over time. It increases the chances of investment in New Zealand and better positions this country to grow. So I'm very pleased. I'm also very pleased, Mr. Speaker, that the bulk of the work in returning this country to surplus has been achieved by constraining the size of government and government spending, which is forecast to drop from a peak of around 35% of GDP down to 30% of GDP over the next 3 to 4 years. And it is worth remembering that the previous Labor government lifted us from about 29% of GDP government spending in 2003-4 all the way up to 34% by 2010, which is what we inherited. This was during the upturn of the cycle. And we had a bit of a debate this morning with David Parker in the Finance Committee, where he questioned those figures and claimed that most of the increase in government spending was due to the earthquake and to working for families tax expenditure. I'm hoping, Mr. Bennett, that you might listen to my speech. And they were debating about the effect of working for families. And what I'd like to point out to Mr. Speaker, Mr. Parker, is I checked the figures, and even if you take working for families tax expenditure out of it, core government spending has increased from 28% to 33% during the time of the Labor government, which was a 5% increase. And putting it another way, Labor grew the size of the core government by 18%, or nearly a fifth, over only a few years. So that's the sort of thing that you do, and I think if anybody was going to apologise in the House today, it should be the Labor government for that massive increase in the size of government. And why is that important? Because basically I think that the economy is divided into that part which is based on voluntary decisions, that is the private economy where people choose to either buy something or a service, and that of the state part of the economy, which is essentially based on compulsion. And I believe that we should be having a smaller state than we've got at the moment, and this government is very focused on getting it back to a reasonable bounds. Under ever an expanding government such as we had in the 2000s, that is appropriating for itself the funds that entrepreneurs could have used to grow the economy, and that's what we need in this country. We've talked about the other areas, about rebuilding Christchurch, about getting better value for our public services, but more importantly, it's also the fourth pillar of the government's work is building a more productive and competitive economy through a wide-ranging program of microeconomic reform, which we call the Business Growth Agenda. But also linked with that is the welfare reforms, which are not meant to be mean or to save money, but primarily because we believe work is a good thing, that seeing people getting out there and working and having earned success is an essential part of fulfilment in life, and that's why to free people from the dependency that FDR used to call the subtle destroyer of the human spirit. And so welfare reform is one of the most important things that this government is doing. Secondly, when we look at the business growth agenda, it is ultimately about breaking down barriers to entrepreneurship. And all of this is designed to give businesses the confidence to invest, to grow and to create jobs so that we can build a more productive economy. And so let's have a look at the sorts of things we're doing. Well, funnily enough, we hear from the Labor Party all about the crisis in manufacturing and the lack of jobs. Well, I spent the last weekend down in Hamilton celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Gallagher Group, one of New Zealand's more successful manufacturing exporters. In fact, a group that I've just written a book about before I was in Parliament. And that company is a very interesting story, doing very well in a difficult time, continuing to succeed in export manufacturing business despite the high dollar, and is not complaining and getting ahead. And when you look back over its history, it went through massive times of transition from the 70s and 80s when, as an exporter, it basically paid no tax. In fact, it received tax back from the tax department in the late 80s, until to a sudden transition in the late 80s and early 90s to a situation where it began paying full 33% tax on its profits. So that transition the Gallagher Group survived, and now it goes on dealing with a fluctuating dollar, which is something that exporters face all around the world. And has learnt over the last 15 or 20 years how to handle those fluctuations, to be careful, to hedge internally, to make sure that there's a lot of components bought in US dollars, and it all makes it possible to survive. And so when we look around, despite the stories of gloom in the manufacturing area, there is actually growth going on in manufacturing in New Zealand. There are plenty of companies who are doing well, and plenty of jobs being created. We just have to look in the food manufacturing area, for example, where more than 1,000 jobs constructing and working in Fonterra's new Darfield milk processing plant. We've got 300 new jobs at Teagle's new factory in West Auckland. Yashili's New Zealand plans to create a Chinese-owned milk processing plant in Pocono. So there's lots and lots of manufacturing jobs being created in this economy right now. And this is why I have every confidence in this budget policy statement. It reflects a government which is thinking very carefully, guiding this country through safely through a difficult period onto what will be a brighter future for all New Zealanders around the corner. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Good speech. Good speech. Well done.
I call Andrew Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Take a call.